Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this Talks at Google virtual event. I'm Cristina Balmon de Castro. I'm part of the Global Network Infrastructure team here at Google. I am thrilled to introduce you to today's guest, Samuel T. Wilkinson. Samuel is an Associate Professor of Psychiatry at Yale University. He also serves there as an Associate Director of the Yale Depression Research Program. He received his MD from Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. His articles have been featured in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal. He has been the recipient of many awards, including top advancements and breakthroughs from the Brain and Behavioral Research Foundation and the top 10 Psychiatry Papers by the New England Journal of Medicine. Samuel's new book, Purpose: What Evolution and Human Nature Imply About the Meaning of Our Existence, uses principles from a variety of scientific disciplines to provide a framework for human evolution and discuss an overarching purpose to our existence. Sam, it's my pleasure to welcome you to Talks at Google.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you for joining us. So one of the statements in your book that had me stop and reflect was the fact that depression is now the leading cause of disability worldwide. Your area of expertise is depression, and your book discusses purpose. Through your research, what's the correlation you've seen between depression and lack of purpose?
There's a very strong relationship there. Most people, if they don't feel that they have some sense of purpose or meaning in their lives, are much more likely to fall into a state of depression and nihilism, really. So it is important for us to be talking about this issue. And there are a couple different levels we can talk about it. One is, does a given person have a personal sense of purpose? Another level that I try to get at is, why are we here? Is there a purpose to our existence, or was life really just an accident? So a lot of different ways we can go with that, but certainly for human flourishing and thriving, having a personal sense of purpose is critical.
Mm-hmm. So I want to anchor us back into the concept of purpose. So in your book, you aim to provide an evolutionary understanding of it, which is quite interesting compared to how this is usually framed. The first chapters of your book discuss Darwin's theory of evolution. I'm a nature lover and I have a research background, so I just couldn't stop reading. You argue against the view that evolution is just random, using what's called convergent evolution. Could you tell us one example of it that you found particularly fascinating?
Yeah, so there's been for a long time this sense that evolution doesn't know where it's going. It's totally random and haphazard. And if we could somehow rewind time and watch the process unfold again, it might go a totally different direction, and there would certainly be no humans and so forth. And therefore, life is essentially a happy accident, and there's no real purpose or meaning to life. Any purpose or meaning that we feel is kind of an illusion. And there's been quite a bit of development in evolutionary biology. Mostly this is drawn on the work of a biologist named Simon Conway Morris, who has discovered these patterns that occur over and over and over and over again, where even genes in different animals kind of develop independently in the same way. So one of the best known examples of this is with the eye. So scientists tell us that eyes have evolved about 40 different times. We have a type of eye called the camera type eye, and we share it with an octopus or a squid. Scientists tell us that our most recent common ancestor did not have an eye, but we each independently evolved essentially the identical structure, which is a remarkable kind of feat. So it seems like there are principles and maybe even natural laws that we don't quite understand that have kind of shaped or guided this process to go in certain directions and not others.
Yeah, I think like there was like a statement in your book that I found particularly fascinating. It was like, eventually if there's a need for an eye, nature will find a way to produce an eye in that organism, which I found like, yeah, pretty fantastic, pretty amazing. with the basis that there is some guidance through evolution and that nature actually prefers mutation that confirms some types of advantages, we get to what we usually refer to as natural selection. You further develop like what I believe is a key concept in your book, which is that this selection, which is usually cited to operate at an individual level, can actually operate at multiple levels. One of the ones that you mentioned is kin selection. I personally found that honeybees were a beautiful kin selection example that you provided. I was wondering if you could briefly, we could briefly use them to explain the kin selection concept to our audience a bit better.
Yeah, the example of the honeybees, this was actually one case that troubled Charles Darwin originally when he was writing, his most famous book, The Origin of Species. So honeybees, you have a hive of honeybees and you have one queen, you have a couple hundred males that are referred to as drones, and you have about 50 or so thousand worker honeybees that are female, but they are also infertile. They cannot reproduce. And so Darwin is thinking, okay, how does this work? If survival and reproduction is so important in this new theory, then why would nature create these honeybees, the vast majority of which are incapable of reproduction? And the solution that he had, that even back then, was that the honeybees are all related, and genetics really wasn't worked out then, but people had long observed that closely related organisms share traits. And so the female worker honeybees were helping their brothers and their sister, and that in the next generation, their traits would then be passed on. And so it's not just at the individual level. On this case, it's a kin level, this giant family of honeybees. And so that helps explain things that previously were difficult to explain if you're just looking at an individual level. And this has really important implications, I argue, for our social traits. So when the reason I wrote this book mainly came about as really an existential crisis of meaning that I had. And one of the things that I didn't like about evolution was what I thought it implied about human nature. Most people have heard of this term survival of the fittest, and there's some problems with it. Most biologists these days prefer to use the phrase natural selection, but I think most people kind of at a gut level understand kind of what survival of the fittest gets at. And the issue that you are asking about has to do with, survival of the fittest. What are we talking about? Survival of the fittest individual or survival of the fittest family and group? And there's debate among biologists about which one of those might have happened, but I think on some level it's pretty clear that natural selection, also known as survival of the fittest, has happened on more than one level, and the social implications for this are really, really important. So at the individual level, we do get things like selfishness and aggression and a lot of the traits that we often think of as not good. But at higher levels, other traits seem to emerge. If you don't mind, let me just share a brief story to kind of drive this point home. So in 1864, and coincidentally, this is the same year that this phrase "survival of the fittest" was coined. There were two shipwrecks at the same time and place in what's called the Auckland Islands. This is a group of islands about 300 miles south of New Zealand, and these shipwrecks. The islands are large enough that they never stumbled upon one another, the survivors. The first ship was led by a man named Thomas Musgrave. And fortunately, after like a year and a half of this harrowing ordeal, all of the men from his crew survived. Now, the second ship was led by a man named George Delgarno. And unfortunately, most of the crew from his ship died. So what was the key difference? Well, the main difference was that Musgrave's group formed this remarkably cooperative and cohesive group of individuals. And this was really epitomized in the first really minutes of the shipwreck when Musgrave himself, the captain, he carried an injured man on his back as he swam through the waves to get to shore. And on the other hand, the second ship, Delgarno's group, they kind of had this every man for himself approach. And this was seen in the first few days of the shipwreck. They left a wounded man behind to die as they searched further inland for food and other resources. So it's not that hard to imagine similar scenarios in our ancient past where it was cooperation and altruism and so forth that was helpful for survival and thus, perpetuity of the human race. So I think, and it's pretty clear looking back through nature, human history and so forth, that we have these kind of competing natures. We do have unfortunately a capacity for selfishness. It's not hard to find examples of that, but we also have this immense capacity for altruism and love and cooperation and so forth.
Yeah, thanks. That was a really nice example in your book. Actually, I really thought it was very telling. I do want to delve a bit deeper into this. Like, much has been said about like humankind being selfish by default and every man for his own, as you said. So I do want to dig a bit deeper into our altruistic nature. So in your book, you discuss this tit for tat, ensure essentially being good, expecting others to be good to us in the future. Skeptics might plunge on to dismiss that we're altruistic by nature. But a powerful proof of this altruistic nature you set with some behavioral experiments that have been done with infants, which I very much enjoy. Like, I think anyone that has observed really, really young kids has seen this behavior probably multiple times. Could you briefly discuss this altruistic by nature infant findings?
Yeah, so even kind of before they learn to fully talk and communicate, it's been observed that toddlers, very young children, will behave altruistically. They will help even a stranger who's is pretending to need help. They can't quite maybe stack a book in the right way, or they're carrying a big load of things and they drop one thing, and the infant will go up and lift and pick up the object, hand it to the adult. So even when there's not any clear close relationship, this is not the primary caregiver of the child, we seem to have this altruism innate within us. But at the same time, I've got 5 kids, and there are periods, especially in the 2s and 3s, where they behave in terribly selfish ways, right? They're crying on the ground, they're throwing a tantrum. So I think one of the messages I'm trying to get across is that it's not this, human nature is not this monolithic single thing. There's a duality to it, and we do have an intrinsic capacity for altruism, but we also have an intrinsic capacity to look out for number one and really number one only. So it's this really interesting paradox that we find as we look deeply at human nature.
So, in short, we're innately capable of altruism, and we're innately capable of hatred. We're capable of aggression, and we're capable of collaboration, and we're more interestingly able to exercise both these capabilities to the extreme, probably more than any other species. Humans have had the most destructive wars, yet we've also extensively collaborated more than any other species and put a few of us on the moon, for example. So you mentioned we can find purpose in choosing between these two natures. So I'm wondering, according to your practice and your findings, what do you think moves the needle? So how do we set ourselves up for success?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm a big fan of the psychologist and writer Jonathan Haidt. He's a psychologist at New York University, and he has this metaphor where there's the elephant and the rider, and they represent kind of different parts of ourselves. And there's a human rider sitting on top of the elephant, and the rider can influence the elephant as long as the elephant doesn't have a strong desire of his own. And so this is kind of the rational part of ourselves that represents the human, or is represented by the human, and then the more intuitive, reflexive part of our nature that is represented by the elephant. And so the trick is, Haidt doesn't necessarily take the metaphor this way, but I will. The trick is to lead your elephant to places where it's going to be on its best behavior, right? And so if you're riding an alcoholic elephant that wanders into a bar it's going to be really hard to control that elephant, right? So it's best not to let the elephant wander into the bar in the first place. You know, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So what are the social situations that are going to help us to elicit the better angels of our nature? And I think a really important one is our personal relationships. So my argument is that the strongest forms of the most pro-social aspects of human nature have come through the way that nature has shaped our personal relationships, and in particular, our family relationships. And when we focus on those relationships, then the better aspects of our nature tend to predominate. And this seems to be particularly true with males, men, and tying them to the rearing of their biological children. They tend to behave in much better ways. They get in trouble less with drugs. They're less violent, and so forth. And so there's this real important tie between biology, culture, fatherhood, and the way that human nature is divided, and we can help kind of push it in one direction and not the other if we help men be engaged in the rearing of their children.
So one of the ways that, like you mentioned, has proven to bring up our altruistic nature is to cultivate the strong personal relationships.
Yeah.
Beyond this, like, it has also been well researched that it's a strong indicator of long-term happiness for us. So in your psychiatric practice, I'm wondering, do you observe an overall decline in strong personal relationships? And my personal curiosity is, how can this be explained in a world where we're more and more connected than ever?
Yeah, it is a huge problem. And for the last, it's unfortunately been going this way for several decades. There's a number of factors that have been driving this. With being more and more connected than ever, the catch is that our virtual relationships are not the same as in-person relationships. When our ancestors evolved, they didn't have smartphones and Facebook and so forth. And so in as much as virtual relationships are crowding out in-person relationships, generally that's a bad trend. Now, certainly these technologies can help us connect with loved ones who are maybe living on the opposite end of the country that we can't, see in person very often. But if they are taking the place of in-person interaction, then it's going to be a negative trend. There's been a breakdown in community, right? Less people are part of community groups, churches, families have struggled. Although it's steadied somewhat in the last 10 or 20 years, overall, over the last 50 or 60 years, the divorce rate has gone up quite a bit. There's the U.S. Surgeon General last year put out this statement saying we're in the midst of an epidemic of loneliness, which of course has to do with a lack of personal relationships. So, a lot of these technologies are helpful, and it's not just technology. There's a cultural aspect as well. But we need to really think about how can we get back to a focus on in-person personal relationships for the good of individual mental health as well as the good of our collective psyche, and really our ability to trust each other and regain a sense of national unity.
Mm-hmm. So I do want to ask you, you're based in New York, I'm based in New York. As civilizations grew, our cities expanded and got increasingly populated. I want to refer back to the example that you cited on the two shipwrecks. And one of the things as I was reading the book that I noticed is that the initial size of the group on one of the shipwrecks was smaller than the other shipwreck. And this tying up to the fact that there's been bigger and bigger cities as we grew as a civilization made me wonder, is there a tie to the size of the group that makes our natural reflex to be altruistic harder to be triggered? Or have you observed that big cities generate maybe less sense of community as more like a cultural thing?
Yeah. So this probably the best the best line of research I can cite in response to this question has to do with what is called Dunbar's number. And Dunbar is a British scholar who has concluded that the magic number is around 150. And what this magic number is basically the number of people that we can, really know in an intimate and personal way. And so it is harder to build a community if you don't have at some level a group that is, 150 or smaller. When it gets, even larger and larger, then there's this sense of kind of depersonalization that you're not able to, know all the people in the community, have kind of a voice in the decisions that are made and so forth. So, obviously there are companies that are a lot larger than this. There are, organizations, universities, but there needs to be at some level an organizing group or unit that allows people to feel like they know each other in the community and they can contribute to the decisions that are being made and so on and so forth. Otherwise, it is going to be, you're going to get free riders. You're going to get people who just feel like there's no point in being a part of this community that's too large. I can't remember everyone's name, and I feel like a nameless face. So that is a challenge, and especially, the internet makes the world smaller in some ways, but makes the building of community more challenging.
I do want to ask a further question on, when it comes to our society, that relates back to one of the statements that you make in the book. Genes don't code for behavioral traits, right? We share, I was impressed to see this number. We share 99.9% of our genes with every other human,
Yep.
Which is remarkable. So tying this back to how hard it is sometimes for us not to build a community. You also mentioned that in multiple cases, or in one special experiment that you mentioned, is easier to build a community when you feel like you share certain things with someone else instead of you are competing against another group of people. Do you find that as a society we're maybe over-indexing on some IQ, physical traits? Should we give more importance to nurture than to nature, and that will maybe help us find communities more easily, or be more altruistic more easily?
Well, there's a couple ways I could go with this question, but one of the things that you're getting at that we tend to do is we tend to self-sort, right? And this, we have this, what's called this, in-group and out-group bias. We tend to form groups, and we identify more closely with those insider group and treat them preferentially than we do those outsider group. And there's a reason that this evolved, but there's some negative consequences as well. And one of the questions is, well, what is a group? And groups can be defined in a lot of different ways: race, political persuasion, gender, IQ, educational training and status, and so forth. And in many ways, that's not good. I think one of the silver linings, however, is that it's the definition of group is very malleable. We can redraw the circles so that they're larger. And what this means is that, we, in some ways groups are helpful, but we always need to challenge ourselves, our own thinking, to be able to redraw that group so that it's larger and larger and larger, and focus on the things we have in common with every other human being, our shared humanity. And this is what, one of the problems that seems to be gripping the US is that we're just so tightly divided by our group affiliation, most notably along political lines. And we need to get back to the real, what I view as a more accurate depiction of human nature is that all of us have strengths and weaknesses, good and bad, the capacity for altruism and selfishness. And we sometimes think that with our in-group, out-group bias, that the people in the other group, they all have they only have weaknesses, they only have bad, there's no strengths. And that's an inaccurate view of human nature, right? We're all a mix of good and bad. Both sides of the political divide have legitimate viewpoints, and we need to kind of get back to a more civil dialogue to try to work together, compromise, and see each other's points of view. And there's lots of proposals as to ways to do that. It's not going to be easy, but I think it just starts with recognizing, having an accurate understanding of human nature, which is that we're all a mix of strengths and weaknesses.
Agreed. So Sam, we're getting close to the end of our time. I'd like to thank you very much for joining us at Talks at Google. The book is, once again, Purpose, What Evolution and Human Nature Imply About the Meaning of Our Existence. I honestly found it to be a history lesson, a science review, and a philosophical debate all at once, which I very much appreciated. Remaining easy to read, which is remarkable. Sam, it's been a delight to spend a bit of time discussing it with you today. Thank you so much again.
Thanks for having me on. It's been a pleasure to chat.
And thanks to everyone in our audience for tuning in. We'll see you at the next Talks at Google.